Welcome Internet. Today we're going to be talking about one of the main fantasies in paranoia and paranoiac states, which is that of absolute transparency. So before we begin, I need to say that this fantasy is ever present in the minds of people with paranoid personalities or who have a form of psychosis, which is paranoiac. But it isn't the psychosis itself. So what I mean by that is that the psychosis is when the person can no longer distinguish between the reality and their inner world. It's when something becomes so merged of the subjective experience with the appreciation of reality that reality testing is lost, i.e. there's no way of making a distinction between both of them. So in this case, what I'm going to talk about is the fact that what is the fantasy, i.e. the internal construct. This doesn't mean that the paranoid is going to act it out, right? But that means that it's something that's always present in their minds, always having an influence. As would, let's say, in another dimension, the neurotic fantasy of the Oedipus complex always has a pull on the individual. Here we're going to talk about this fantasy that has a pull on the paranoid. So this fantasy is that of absolute transparency. So what is it? Well, it's this idea that the paranoid expects of others, fantasizes that others will be absolutely transparent. So this is a fantasy in the sense that it's always utterly impossible, but the paranoid expects others to be completely truthful, to never contradict, to never lie, to in a way never have a secret garden in which they would be excluded. It's fine if they know about it, but it's not fun if it's there and they have no way of knowing what it is. So often they create a whole set of beliefs that they, how can I say, can guess people, can understand people. It is not uncommon for a paranoid to tell you that they would have made a great psychologist or a great psychiatrist because they can tell people completely well. They see through people. And it's often something that is very prevalent in the discourse. They might say, people are like an open book to me, or I would dream that everyone would be transparent as glass. And it's in these kinds of settings, when these kinds of wordings, that you see that the paranoid in his fantasy, that everyone should be, how can I say, clear. So why is that? Why do they have that fantasy? Well, this fantasy of absolute transparency is there because if someone is absolutely transparent, they're no longer a threat because you know exactly what to expect of them. There is no conniving, no scheming, no plotting because you know. And therefore, they create in their minds a fantasy that they know what's inside of the other, or that they want to know. And sometimes they even tell you that. Like, for example, oh, if only I knew what was in their minds, or if only I could read them like an open book, right? So there is this element in which basically they always pull back to of wanting the others to be completely and utterly foreseeable. Because what you have to understand is with absolute transparency comes absolute control. The paranoid can then act on what he feels is the best option for him, right? So basically, what's going to happen is that if you're absolutely transparent, or the paranoid feels that the other is absolutely transparent, then there is nothing to fear. In a way, it's something in which his paranoia is at peace, because the fantasy is fulfilled. It's when they have no longer anything to basically go off that they might trigger a more psychotic element in which they will project what they hate of themselves or of others into others, i.e. I'm not the one that wants to hurt them, they the one that want to hurt me. But often before this happens, there's a long phase of basically wishing that others were clear as crystal. So where does this stem from? Well, according to psychoanalytic theory, this basically fantasy stems from the very early moments of life in which the child basically cannot accept that the relationship with the caregiver is out of his control, out of his will. This is a very important phase because according to authors like Melanie Klein, the baby basically merges with the object, feels that he can summon mother, he can summon mother's actions. Mother is absolutely transparent. Mother is at his orders, and therefore he feels at peace because mother can be controlled. The problem is that baby is going to feel tension, massive amounts of tension, and then he's going to project it onto mother. All the bad sins that baby can't accept are going to be projected onto a crystal clear mother that's not going to basically force herself onto the child. Therefore, if mother is completely foreseeable, if she's an object, if she's reduced to a tool, then it's okay, it's fine, because they're protected, they know what to expect and know what to do. The whole problem comes and erodes from the fact that others have their own subjectivity, which the paranoid cannot control and will never be able to control. Therefore, they're always afraid, terrified that that subjectivity will come back to hurt them, to destroy them. Therefore, what happens is that they attack first because they're terrified of being attacked. Thus, there is a whole set of issues. But that absolute transparency is there because fundamentally, I think in it, they feel that there's a way for their sense of paranoia to be at peace, because there's nothing to be afraid when you know exactly what's going to happen. On another side note, I wanted to also say that basically this fantasy is something you can also find in architecture through what's called the panopticon. So for those of you who don't know, the panopticon is this idea that it's a prison. I think it's Jeremy Bentham that designed it, the idea at least, that it's a prison in which you can observe others, but you don't know, and the prisoners do not know if they are being observed or not, but you can see all of them at once. Basically, the prisoners are allowed no intimacy, no privacy, and basically the prisoner starts to think that he's always under control, therefore he self-disciplines. And I've always felt that this idea of panopticon just pinpoints exactly the paranoid fantasy of absolute transparency, i.e. you're in position in the panopticon of absolute control, absolute sight of everything that's happening for everyone at the same time, i.e. no more surprises. Thus, you're in full control. Nothing can happen to the prison keeper if there is a panopticon, or at least that's the theory, right? But here what is important in the panopticon is this idea that there is no longer any privacy, anything that can be hidden. Even the most minute actions are under surveillance, and that's exactly what the paranoid seeks. He seeks to put under surveillance, be it consciously or unconsciously, other people, because there is a deep sense of fear that all of their hatred will come back and be turned against them, that people will revolt, that things will get out of their control. But if they know, and this is a big theme in paranoia, knowledge. The paranoid often is the one that knows. They know what you're thinking. They know what you're going to do. They know what is going to happen to others, or what is going to happen and how they're going to be able to defend themselves. The paranoid, because he projects his own beliefs into others, basically has an unconscious knowledge of his own beliefs. Therefore, he's going to see in others the mirror of himself. Therefore, he knows himself, but he projects it onto others. But it's very common, and it's very, very, how can I say, important to understand in paranoia. It's massively a defense mechanism against the unpredictability and unproductive nature of the relationship, that there's something deep inside of them where they're afraid, they're terrified of what could happen. Therefore, they block that terror that's binded with the unknown through the idea of all-knowing and all-transparency, i.e., if I know everything, and if there's everything to know, and if I can see everything, I become omnipotent, all-capable, omniscient, I know everything. Therefore, nothing can happen. And in a way, it allows them to ascend to a state of absoluteness and of feeling completely in control of everything. In a way, what happens in their minds is that they ascend to a form of godhood in which they are above all of everyone else and they can predict everything. Of course, this is purely fantasy, and if it goes too far, it's completely delusional. But the pull is nevertheless there, and that pull is there because they're deeply, irrevocably afraid of what could happen, afraid that the object might become unstable, hateful, vengeful, and the paranoid often does not know how to cope with those emotions, or sometimes even sadness and despair. They don't really know how to do it, because that doesn't go really well into the system of attacked or being attacked. Therefore, they don't really know, and thus they preemptively want everything to be completely, utterly visible to avoid any of the complexities. Of course, because this is completely, utterly impossible, right? What ends up happening is that the paranoid feels that someone is out to get him eventually. And of course, there's a lot of nuance to be talked about. It's not to say to lump it in like just a simple explanation, but there is always a point where they feel very, very, very persecuted. And that sense of persecution often comes from the fact that they don't know, or that they know too much. But it's triggered because there's something that they don't know, and that, in response, creates a wave in which they feel completely persecuted, because not knowing allows them to completely project everything, all the bad elements, all the psychotic elements, onto the other's behavior or the other's secrecy. Therefore, it becomes kill or be killed, destroy the secret and live, or allow the secret to prevail and be destroyed by the secret. Therefore, there's no at peace with the secret of others. And the important point, very interesting point, because you might think, well, then if others are absolutely transparent, then paranoid is absolutely transparent. Absolutely not. In this fantasy, the paranoid themselves, like in the panopticon, are in a place where they can't be seen and they don't want to be seen. Basically, they expect everyone else to be clear but them. They themselves would be the exception, the ones that are basically obscure or obfuscated in the fact that they are hidden, because they themselves are afraid of others seeing all the negative inside of them. That in a way, they're very afraid of becoming transparent. Therefore, it is very common for paranoids to lie, to manipulate, to use others as shields, because they don't want to be seen as transparent. And it's often the reason why, except when they are in incredible states of crises, we psychologists, don't really see them in our private practices, maybe more so in institutions, but much less in the private practice, because they're very, very afraid of that, of being seen through. Therefore, they tend to withdraw and not want to engage with the therapists. And thus, they feel that the therapist might themselves be a form of panopticon on them. Therefore, they might be very afraid, or very unwilling, or very, very aggressive with the therapist. Therefore, you can see that this idea of absolute transparency basically goes throughout their whole lives. It can be with the therapist, but it can also be with the wife, with the children, with the employees or employer. It doesn't matter. What matters is that they have to know. And if they don't know, then they start projecting every bad element they have inside onto others. And because of that lack of transparency, they also have a lack of self-transparency, meaning that basically they don't really have a lot of ability for introspection, because that would be too scary. Once they discover that they're divided, both on a conscious and unconscious mind, it becomes very difficult, because that would basically go to admit that they don't know the unconscious mind. They don't know what's deep down inside of them. And that's terrifying, because that's admitting weakness and vulnerability, which is something that they can't deal with their own weakness and vulnerability. It's fine if it's when it's in others, but once it's inside them, then it becomes impossible. It becomes something that's an untouchable, and dare I say, even unthinkable, to even say that they have weaknesses and terrors and fears. And often it takes an incredibly strong therapeutic relationship for them to just start thinking in not absolutes, like not I know or I'm sure of it, but it's saying maybe, perhaps, or I was wrong. All of those basic, let's say, human interactions require, when they're genuine, a lot of effort on the paranoid to be able to cast aside his fears and be able to accept his own sense of vulnerability. So that was pretty much it for the discussion. I hope you found it interesting. Of course, as always, this is not absolute truth. This is based on my clinical experience, but it's not, how can I say, exact science, right? So take it as an opinion and as a hypothesis, all right? So if you have anything to say, please leave it in the comments. I will answer all of them. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.